Hello, and welcome to the Daily Rings of Power podcast, your daily dose of the latest news, rumours, and speculation about the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power. The day is Monday, August 29th, and I'm your host, Harry. I hope you're having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. I want to start the show by apologising for only releasing a couple of episodes last week. I was battling technical difficulties with my audio setup, and combined with needing to travel in the second half of the week, it made releasing regular episodes a challenge. However, we're going to be making up for that. It's release week for the Rings of Power, and to be honest, it almost doesn't feel real. I'll be attending the world premiere in London tomorrow night, and I have to thank Fellowship of Fans, who kindly invited me along as one of their guests. I'll be releasing an episode on Wednesday, recapping my experience at the event and sharing whatever spoiler-free thoughts I can on the first two episodes. If possible, I might also see if I can get some quick thoughts from other attendees at the premiere so I can share those with you too. However, to start the week, we have a long overdue episode. This time, talking about anything and everything Harfoots. I couldn't do this alone, and was lucky enough to be joined by my good friend from Lord of the Rings Twitter, Kylie. We discussed everything from the purpose of Harfoots in the show, the individual characters in that storyline, and you'll be pleased to hear we do a deep dive into the stranger's identity and his potential path forward in the show. As always, before we start, we must begin the episode with a reading from the Professor's work. Today's reading was chosen by Kylie and comes from The Lord of the Rings, Book 1, A Long-Expected Party. It was a fine night, and the black sky was dotted with stars. He looked up, sniffing the air. What fun! What fun to be off again, off on the road with dwarves. This is what I've really been longing for years. Goodbye, he said, looking at his old home and bowing to the door. Goodbye, Gandalf. Goodbye for the present, Bilbo. Take care of yourself. You are old enough, and perhaps wise enough. Take care. I don't take care. Don't you worry about me. I'm as happy now as I ever have been, and that is saying a great deal. But the time has come. I'm being swept off my feet at last, he added, and then, in a low voice, as if to himself, he sang softly in the dark. The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow, if I can, pursuing it with eager feet, until it joins some larger way where many paths and errands meet, and whither then, I cannot say. Thank you to Kylie for that perfect choice of reading for today. One quick disclaimer before we get into the episode: we recorded this conversation last week, and so we unfortunately had not seen the new Harfoots featurette, therefore we didn't have some of the details on where the Harfoots are located in the show, but I still think our speculation was interesting. Now, without further delay, let's get into the conversation. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the show my good friend from Lord of the Rings Twitter, Kylie. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you. I'm really excited to be on here.
Fantastic. I'm excited to have you on here. I'm excited that we're finally going to get to talk about Harfoots. I have done them a great misdeed by not covering them enough on my first episodes.
Well, to be fair, there's not much information on them, so...
Too true. We have been working with scraps, but luckily, before we recorded today, we got a new clip. We've got a soundtrack to talk about. We've got some stuff. Great. So before we get into all things Hobbits and Harfoots, I want to start the show, as we always do when we have a guest on, by asking, what was your introduction to Tolkien? How did you first get into Lord of the Rings?
Yeah, so I've only been into Lord of the Rings for exactly a year. Exactly a year ago, I decided to watch the movies, but a few months before that, in the spring of 2021, I decided to read the Hobbit book. because I was just really yearning for another fantasy world to get into. And obviously, Lord of the Rings is right there. That was an obvious choice. So I read the Hobbit book, um, and I really enjoyed the book, but that wasn't quite what got me really into the obsession level. It wasn't until a few months later that I decided to watch the Hobbit films. And I knew the reputation that the Hobbit films had, but I really enjoyed them. And so, right after the Hobbit movies, I watched The Lord of the Rings, and that's what did it. I got my hands on the books as soon as I could. I read the Silmarillion right after that. Uh, yeah, it's been a crazy year of really deep diving into Tolkien.
Yeah. So you've kind of gone from 0 to 100 in the space of a year then.
Yeah, yeah.
And in terms of the show, the Rings of Power, what we're all here to talk about today, when did you first become aware of that? How long have you been following it, and when did that really start to become a focus of your current obsession?
Well, I think I actually did hear about it a little bit when it was announced, but because I wasn't, into Lord of the Rings, I just only saw any sort of rumors that were flying around and people's concerns, but I didn't really have any opinion on it because I wasn't really into it. But once I got into Lord of the Rings, that's when the conversations about the show were starting to pop up since it was very imminent. And so I'd say I was very skeptical actually at first. Um, I didn't have the greatest expectations for it, but I think once the title reveal dropped in December of last year, I think that's when my excitement really started. And with those hands posters that released in, I think it was January, that really, I really did a 180 and started allowing myself to get excited.
Nice, nice. Well, that's great to now understand how you got into Lord of the Rings and then the show. But I guess seeing as the topic of today's conversation is really about Harfoots, I think we have to start with what is it about hobbits that draws you so much then? What is it about their stories that you love so much?
I think it's really just the relatability that hobbits really have and how Tolkien wrote them. I remember when I was reading The Hobbit for the first time, I was really amazed at how relatable Bilbo was to me. And for me, I don't find a lot of protagonists to be particularly relatable.
Mm.
I love many characters, but that doesn't mean I necessarily relate to them on a very deep level. And I find that hobbits just have this really relatable nature to them. They're very good-hearted, and they're just very different than most protagonists that you see in fantasy series.
Mm. Yeah, I think I know when they were kind of just starting up the marketing for this show, Lenny Henry, who's playing one of the lead kind of Harfoots in the show, he,
Hmm.
he described the characters as the traditional Tolkien little guy, and I think there's something to that, right? This idea that like while they are heroic, they're not heroic necessarily in a sense that you would traditionally see as protagonists in a fantasy story.
Yeah, and you would say like maybe characters like Aragorn are the typical type of hero prototype.
Mm.
So to have hobbits be the center of the story, it's just really different. And also there's something about their culture and something about the Shire that it's very idyllic. Like
Mm.
you want to live there. You want to be like them. You want to go there. You want to escape
Mm.
to this place that seems to idolize and value things like nature and food and company, and I think we're missing a lot of that in our day-to-day lives, and so when you see that in fiction, it just really grabs you.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point because, especially the point you made about it's something we're missing in our daily lives. Because obviously, when Tolkien was writing The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and all these stories to start with, he himself was lamenting, this move away from the pastoral, this move towards the industrial, the modern
Yeah.
technology. And so it's kind of funny that 100 years later, almost, we're having the same conversations, but it's to a much more extreme level than I'm sure even Tolkien himself could have
Hmm.
ever imagined.
Yeah, and that's the thing about his stories is that they're still they still speak to us even in very different circumstances. The world is in a very different circumstance than it was when he wrote them,
Mm.
but it's still on the same level, kind of the same.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's why, and we'll pivot slowly to talking about Harfoots, which is obviously the purpose of this episode. But I think
Hmm.
that's one of the reasons why I think it makes so much sense for the showrunners to say, look, there isn't any, or there aren't any stories about the hobbits and or in this case, the Harfoots pre the Third Age. Tolkien himself says there are no tales told, although admittedly, as the hobbits themselves say in the books, this is a point of disagreement for them. They say, we've always been here. It's just that we've never made it into your stories. But that's why I think it makes so much sense for me to want to include this sort of perspective within a narrative, which, when we think about the Second Age story, is so grim and so dark at times, that having that pastoral, that rural levity is almost like a much needed counterbalance, right?
Yeah, and I can understand to a point why some people might be concerned over the Harfoot's inclusion because of, lore or whatever, and they have to really make stuff up from scratch because Tolkien didn't write about it. But I think it would have been a mistake not to include them
Mm,
because as easy as it is for Tolkien to just write, oh, well, they weren't really important, so they're not in here, because the way he wrote everything was kind of from like a historical document kind of
mm,
standpoint, as if he was translating something that was real. If you're going to show a story visually and to create a narrative and have these characters go all across the map of Middle Earth, you can't just not include one of the most important races to the original story
yeah.
and what people really latch on to.
Yeah, it's interesting as well because I've followed some kind of more some fan reactions to the trailers and the clips, who perhaps aren't really massive Tolkien fans, or they've watched the films and haven't really thought about it in a good 6-8 years. All of them instantly recognize the Harfoots as hobbits.
Hmm.
I remember when the first pictures coming out, people were saying like, "Oh, they don't look like hobbits because they're dirty and they're not dressed like the hobbits we know," and many other reasons. But what's interesting is when you ask a fan who hasn't been following this really closely or hasn't read the books, as soon as you show them those characters, every single one of them is like, "Oh yeah, hobbits," right? Like it's instant for them.
Yeah, and some people have said, oh, well, they're just doing this for nostalgia or fan service, and maybe in a sense it is, but I think there is real story purposes for including them that are very, very
Mm,
important. If you didn't include them, you would lose some of the magic that what makes not to diss on people who prefer elves or
hmm
whatever, but I think there's a grounded nature to the stories that surround hobbits.
Yes, definitely. And I think, as you kind of, circling back to what you said at the start, I don't think it would be right to underestimate the value of having characters that are relatable, right? Like, I feel like, to go back to the original trilogy, Evelyn, there's a lot of people who are like, oh, I love Aragorn, I love Legolas, I love Boromir, I love Faramir, I love whoever.
Yeah,
But no one kind of, I don't think there's many people who are like, oh, yeah, I'm basically Aragorn, or, I'm basically Legolas, because
yeah,
they're heroic archetypes. That there is a sense in which, especially in the books, like if we think about book Aragorn, who's very different to film Aragorn. Book Aragorn, he's got his destiny. He's destined to be king. He knows what he's doing. He's kind of a self-sure man, and he does sit above the rest of us. And so there's an extent to which, when you're reading those stories, you can admire that sort of character, but you can't, to a certain extent, you can't see yourself in them. At least that's what I've thought.
and I totally agree with you.
Yeah. So moving on from kind of the wider, I guess, the meta role that they're playing in the show, right? As the audience's representation, the audience's way in, that ground level view. Let's talk about some of the core things we know, right, about the Harfoot story. And I think the first place we should start with is this idea of them not as the hobbits that a lot of us know as settled in the Shire, homely, afternoon tea, all that. They are a migratory, wandering people. How are you thinking about that? What interests you about that? And what role do you think that plays in their story?
Well, yeah, here's where it gets interesting because I think a lot of what people associate with hobbits is inherently tied to their life in the Shire.
Mm-hmm.
And their life in the Shire obviously, has an impact on how the characters act, what things they like, things like that. So taking away that bit there, taking away the Shire completely changes their culture to an extent. And so you really want to hope for a sense of familiarity since they're still, kind of hobbits. You want them to still have to be familiar with the race that we know and love.
Mm.
And I think from what we've seen so far, I really think they're doing a great job. While everything that we've seen is very different, up to the clothes, their way of life, very different from the hobbits in the Shire. Like you said, when people see them, they immediately recognize them as hobbits.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's something, I'm probably skipping ahead a bit, but you just kind of hit on something that I was thinking about, which is in the final trailer that got released yesterday, we had this great line where, Largo, who's played, I believe, by Dylan Smith, says, there's one thing basically that separates us from the rest of Middle-earth, one thing that we do better, and that is, holding true to one another with our hearts, that great line, bigger than our feet.
I love that line.
It's such a good line, and the reason I love it so much is because, as you said, we take them out of the Shire, right? So that is fundamentally different. But if we think about what defines hobbits on a thematic level, it's their courage despite their size. It's their love for one another, their fidelity, whether you think about Frodo and Sam, Merry and Pippin, whoever it might be, even Bilbo with Thorin and the dwarves in The Hobbit, there is this sense that they are incredibly loyal, incredibly open with their hearts and with their hospitality. And so I think that's one of those things where we've changed the setting, but the fundamental thing that makes hobbits hobbits and Harfoots Harfoots has not changed at all, right?
Yeah, I definitely agree. But what's interesting about being able to change the setting is I could see how they've gotten to be really creative with their aesthetic. And it's just really fun to see the costumes, the sets, from the stills that have been released.
Mm.
They've really taken their opportunity that they have with their creative freedom, I should say,
Mm-hmm.
and they've really ran with it. And I love to see that.
Yeah. And, I think maybe this is a good time because some people might not have been following it as closely, but they've included lots of really interesting details. I mean, we haven't seen this yet on screen or in dialogue, but we've heard this through interviews about their migratory lifestyle, right? So like this idea that they follow the seasons as well as the crops. And we know that this is something that migratory real world cultures do. They follow the land where they can still grow food, where they can still harvest food. There's this idea that we heard about in a recent interview, which was just so lovely. This idea that they have this sacred apple orchard and they carry the apple seeds in memory of their dead and their lost family members, because they bury their family members, I think, in this orchard, right? And there's something beautifully attuned to nature in that.
Yeah, and actually earlier I was trying to zoom in on the costumes of our main Harfoot characters, trying to see if I could spot any of those apple seeds. I couldn't, but I just think that's such a lovely detail. And we might not really get to even see it, but to just now know about it is, I mean, it's just details like that really make me feel like the creators, the showrunners, and the actors, just everybody behind the show, really deeply care about creating a world that feels real and detailed. It's great.
Yeah. Well, and that was the thing. I talked about this on my podcast yesterday, where I broke down the trailer. I talked about the fact that there's a scene in that trailer where Nori hands the stranger, and we'll definitely get onto the stranger. Don't worry, anyone listening.
Oh yeah.
We're not gonna skip over that. But there's a scene where Nori hands the stranger an apple, and in the wide shot we get of that, we get to see the tree branches above Nori's head, and you can see that the fruit on that tree, and it may actually be from a different scene, I'm not sure yet, but the fruit on that tree is all withered and dying. So there's this idea that because the Harfoots are close to the land, they're actually going to be some of our perspective in terms of seeing that evil has returned, because they're not just going to see it in orcs roaming or, whatever it is, or actual
Mhm.
bad guys. They're going to see that the spread of evil is infecting the very earth, which for me is that's a very Tolkienian theme, right? When you think about like Mirkwood and other examples,
Yeah.
that feels really spot on to me.
Yeah, especially since I believe it was the multiplying of men and the evil that infected Mirkwood is what primarily pushed them further west.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And I think we should actually talk about this idea of like, why are they migratory, right? Because obviously we know where they're going to end up, or their distant, descendants going to end up. But there's a question here of like, okay, well they're wandering, they're migratory, but why are they? And I think this is where we probably have to go back to the Wandering Day track, and
Oh
I've,
yeah.
I've kind of skipped ahead to talk about it, but that's fine because I love it, and you very helpfully, so that I know I've already thanked you for this, but thank you again on the podcast. You very helpfully transcribed the lyrics to this track, and I've got them in front of me. I'm sure you do too. But
Yeah, I actually do too.
yeah, so let's talk about the lyrics. What are your thoughts on the significance of some of these lyrics, and maybe we can touch on that whole migratory aspect as well.
Well, yeah, the first thing I did notice was that it does insinuate that they weren't always on the move.
Mm,
And yes, the light in the tower, no longer my home. Now, I can't really say for certain what that tower
mm,
would mean, but I do think it's really interesting that it does coincide with I the other day I read the prologue to Fellowship of the
mm-hmm,
Ring concerning hobbits, and it did say that the hobbits of the Shire, like there was an original home,
mm-hmm.
but they'd had that original home where it was is completely lost.
Mm,
And so I think that's the connection there.
yeah,
I'm trying to find the quote. I had it. Um,
no worries.
but yeah, they did have an original place that they stemmed from,
Mm.
but the location of which is, completely forgotten in their history.
Yeah, and I think one of the things it reminded me of, maybe on a slightly different track, was there's a passage in the chapter of the Silmarillion in the Coming of Men, when Finrod, Galadriel's brother, has first met the men, and for anyone who hasn't read the Silmarillion, the men awoke sometime after the elves in Middle-earth, so they're referred to as the Aftercomers, and they awoke in the east of Middle-earth, and Finrod was one of the first of the High Elves, the Noldor, to interact with them, and he learned much from them. They learned much from him. But one of the things Tolkien tells us that he asked them is, where did you come from, and why did you leave? Because they're all moving westward, the three tribes of men at this time, and they basically say, we don't talk about it because there is a darkness that lies on our hearts, and we don't want to talk about it, and we want to leave that in the past. And I almost felt like there were echoes of that in this song, right? Because we've got the lyrics, as you said: the light in the tower, no longer my home, past eyes of pale fire, black sand for my bed. As some people have pointed out on Twitter, black sand for my bed, that could refer to volcanic, ground that has been kind of volcanized. by volcanic activity. So maybe there's an essence here in which the land they came from was uninhabitable. But I just think it's really interesting, given that we know that hobbits themselves are, in some ways, descendants of men. You know, they're not, as the joke Gimli makes in the Two Towers film, they didn't spring up out of holes in the ground. They are hobbits are descendants of men. So this idea that the first men moved west because of some great darkness, and the Harfoots, at least within the show's canon, seem to be doing the same.
Yeah, and I definitely think that that's as close to what even Tolkien might have intended, even because there's definitely that parallel there between hobbits and men, even though they're definitely separate. And them moving west, it um, was because of the darkness that was falling onto Greenwood,
Mm,
and it becoming Mirkwood. That's what really pushed them. That was what pushed them over the Misty Mountains, I believe.
mm-hmm.
They were already wandering before that, but what pushed them through the perilous journey over the Misty Mountains was, I
Mm.
believe, um, when Mirkwood was becoming Mirkwood.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess in many ways what we're probably seeing here is that the hobbits and the Harfoots, over the course of the three ages, who knows when, it's probably very difficult to put a point in the timeline and say here's the point where some men became Harfoots, hobbits, stools, all
Yeah.
these things. But obviously it happened at some point, and that's probably some point in the first age, early second age, who knows. But I guess by the point we meet them in this show, they've made it far enough west that they're now, we assume, I mean, to be honest, this is one of the things I was going to raise with you. Actually, we kind of don't know exactly where they are, right? Because do we know for a fact they're in the Southlands area, or are they further west? I'm not sure.
Well, in the prologue, when I was reading,
Mm,
it did mention that they, at least the first records that the
mm,
hobbits have, which again, grain of salt with that, because the hobbits don't even have all of their own records. Even
yeah.
they only started documenting things once the Shire was founded. Um, they might be in the lower parts of the Misty Mountains
Hmm.
near. I think I remember reading somewhere near the Vales of the Anduin.
Yeah.
But they might be further east or south than that currently, at least from when we see them in the show.
Yeah, I suppose the only other clue we've really had in the show is that in that, can't remember which trailer, it might have been the main teaser, the one before Comic Con, when we had that scene of one of the Harfoots kind of all camouflaged, but with like corn, corn as like a, and so we know that places them in the same area as some of the human settlements, but we don't actually know, I think, whether that human settlement we saw in that human, fields of grain, whether that's the same as Bronwyn and Theo's and all those which we now know is in the Southlands, which we now know is pre-Mordor. So I think you're right. I think they could be. I think we can probably safely say they're somewhere between that area, what they're calling the Southlands, and the Vale of Anduin. But we probably don't know exactly. And because so much more of Middle Earth is forested at this time, before all the deforestation we're going to get in the second age, in the late second age, it's kind of hard to actually place them where they are. But maybe for the show's purposes, that's actually completely fine, right? Because that's kind of the point. They're wandering, they're migratory. We don't need to point to a map and say this is exactly where the Harfoots are.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think they are fairly close to the Southlands, um, simply because of the trailer footage does and does seem to suggest that, what, like you said, when that Harfoot, I think it was a Harfoot woman with that like hay on
Mm,
her head, and she was blowing a whistle. That she was hiding and possibly scouting the area. I'm certain, to make sure it's probably safe for them to move, because they don't want to be
mm.
spotted. So if they don't want to be spotted by men, then they're likely near enough to men, and it does seem to look like that field in the Southlands that we saw in the featurette.
Yeah, I think there's also the question, and again, I promise we will come on to this later, but it's kind of like, how's the stranger going to interact with all this? And if the stranger,
Oh yeah.
we've heard Daniel Wayman, who plays the stranger, say he's going to come into contact with other communities and cultures. I don't think we should assume that he's just going to be with the Harfoots for all 8 episodes, or at least not with the Harfoots in isolation. So there's a really interesting thing there, I guess, of that pull between their migratory patterns, the fixed nature of human settlements, and then you almost throw in this wild card dynamic, which is the stranger, and you're suddenly like, well,
Oh
you can
yeah.
see where the tension's coming from there, and I guess maybe this is a good point to move to some of the characters, because I think once we start discussing some of the individual Harfoot characters, that's going to then lead us into how does the plot start to look? How does the interaction with the stranger look? I mean, I don't know if you have already a particular favorite Harfoot that you want to start talking about, or we can go from the top.
Well, I can't really pick a favorite, but I'm already really liking Nori. I like what we know about her so far is that she apparently likes to take risks, but not risks out of, just to cause trouble, but risks to out of love, and I really think that's a very unique thing for her character, because I know that a lot of people have said, oh, Poppy and Nori seem to be like Merry and Pippin, or they seem to be like Sam and Frodo, and I think I see echoes of both of those duos in them, and I'm really glad, because a lot of times with sequels or prequels or whatever, characters, they try to rehash the same kind of dynamics that you see in the original piece, and I'm already seeing it be very unique, and I think that's a really good thing, that we can see those echoes of the characters we love, but they don't seem to be copy-paste.
No, definitely. And I thought, that was the funny thing when I watched this, that new clip we had today of Nori and Poppy trying to help the stranger. My first thought was like, oh, this feels very Merry and Pippin in terms of the dynamic. But then after I watched it a couple of times, I thought, well, it feels Merry and Pippin because there's a side of comic relief. They're clearly two very good friends. But actually, then when you hear what they're talking about and their outlooks on the world, it's not really the same, because as you said, Nori takes risks. But what was funny, when Poppy was talking to her, she was saying, oh, this isn't the stranger, this isn't a man, this isn't an elf, this isn't some eagle or bird with a broken wing, which, like, immediately, right, that's like a huge tell for us. Like, Nori is the sort of person who would find a wounded animal and want to care for it. And I feel like that's almost like, that is not trying to replicate any Hobbit we've seen before.
Yeah, and it's a very revealing part of her character, I think. It shows that she has a lot of empathy, I think, and especially when you start getting into the stranger, she wants to help the stranger. She wants to help people. She wants to help animals. She wants to help, and she has a lot of love in her, I think. And I think that has the potential to make a really, really great character.
And how do you think about, because you've kind of already mentioned about the fact that they're similar but not the same to the Frodo Sam duo, the Merry Pippin duo. How do you think about that relationship between her and Poppy, and the role Poppy plays in that?
Well, I definitely got big, like, Sam and Frodo vibes when they were describing how Poppy, tags along because of the love that she has for Nori. And we still have yet to see the full dynamics of the whole family of, with Largo and Marigold, and how Poppy fits into that situation. Where's Poppy's parents? Is she an orphan? Was she raised by Nori's parents, or does she just tag along with them now? There's a lot of questions of how the dynamic will develop, and but I do get a lot of Sam and Frodo, like, yeah, like vibes, but also even some imagery as well. And I think that was purposeful.
So talk to me about that imagery. What's the imagery that listeners should be looking for in terms of those parallels?
I mean, I think you first have Nori, who is kind of front and center and kind of taking the lead, which
Mm,
would be mirroring Frodo a little bit. And then again, you have that friend who will just stick with them through thick and thin
mm.
and will do anything that they need to protect their friend. And I believe that Poppy also has that. That was described of her, that she just wants to protect Nori, and that's very Sam. That echoes Sam completely.
Mm. Yeah, and it's interesting as well. I thought in that clip today, it wasn't. She talked about the fact that, oh well, if people if the other Harfoots find out we've helped a stranger, and clearly, we've heard from the very first articles about the Rings of Power that they have this rule, don't interact with the big folk. Stay out of their way because it's only going to bring us trouble. And what was interesting to me, she wasn't saying like, oh, I'm going to get in trouble. It was more like like, I am concerned about
Yeah,
you, Nori. I'm concerned that you are going to get yourself in trouble.
yeah, and it also kind of shows that the Harfoots are kind of superstitious because Poppy was saying how if the fog is for too long, or if a wheel gets stuck, they will be blamed as if they have brought some sort of bad luck or
Yeah.
curse upon their tribe, which I think is really funny, and I think it makes sense though for the Harfoots to have that kind of superstitious type of outlook.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think it's got that sense of, in the same way, a lot of um if you're a migratory community, if you're a nomadic community, and to be honest, even if you are an agricultural based community, like you look at medieval, you look at kind of pre-industrial revolution societies, what is going to fundamentally make or break, your agrarian class, your farmers, your livestock, all of that is going to be the weather. And so, of course, people thought that, if the weather is something that is impacted by fate or a divine power or whatever it might be, well, then people are going to think, well, our behavior could cause a drought or a famine or whatever
Yeah.
it might be. So a bad crop yield is because, something happened in the town, or because the king did something bad, or because we offended this or that. And so it's almost like a microcosm of that, which I think is really fun without the kind of I don't get the sense that they're going to be doing it in a sort of monotheistic way, like we've offended God.
Mhm.
I think it's more about like
Yeah.
we have become out of balance with the land.
Yeah, I definitely think that's what they're going for. But what's interesting though is that to me it seems that Sadok Burrows,
Mm,
his scrolls, he seems to be studying the skies. He
mm,
knows something up about the skies. If you look at the scrolls, it does seem to look like he's documenting some sort of astronomical,
mm.
thing. And his line in some of the trailers, the skies are strange. He knows something is happening. And so I'm really interested in seeing how his his character will interact with Nori and Poppy and the stranger. When they help the stranger, do they how long do they keep him a secret? How long is it until the rest of the Harfoots find out? Because they can't really keep something that big a secret for very long.
No, it's so true. But you have got me thinking as well about those scrolls, and for people who may have forgotten, if you go back and look at some of the first trailers we got, which included Lenny Henry's character Sadok Burrows, um, he's studying these scrolls, and we can see on it that there are kind of glyphs. I think there was someone on Twitter, and I apologize, I've forgotten their name, who said that this was actually a form of glyph that Tolkien himself had
Yeah.
studied, not one he invented, but one he'd studied. And so I'm kind of interested in as well, like, I wonder whether these are things they've picked up rather than things they've made themselves, because
Mhm.
something about the theme from the soundtrack as well, this wandering day, it sounds like, and I may be reading too into this, but it sounds like they may be a culture, as you said earlier, because they don't restart recording their histories until they get to the Shire. Maybe they are an orally based culture where they record their stories through tales and through song. So it's one of those things where I'm kind of in two minds about, it would make sense if these are scrolls he's keeping himself, but it would also be interesting if whether they're heirlooms, things they've picked up on their travels, things they've discovered, and he's trying to interpret them, but without that base cultural knowledge you might need to understand them.
Yeah, they might have some glyphs themselves, but I do think it would be likely that currently their culture is more through oral tradition.
Mm,
Um, I think a lot of, and I know that a lot of indigenous cultures were originally through oral
mm,
tradition. Not all of them, but there's a lot of indigenous practices of oral tradition, and especially when you remember that hobbits and the Harfoots, especially as noted in this Wandering Day, they value song, and I
mm,
think that they might use song to tell those stories.
mm. And there's something interesting, and to go back to the lyrics of that song, something interesting I thought about was that if you go to, and this is just for any listeners following along at home, if you go to those last paragraphs, there's this idea that they're asking the land, they're saying, call to me, lands far away. And then in that last line, they basically, the idea is that they're waiting for the land to answer them back, to give a response. And it reminded me actually, I love it because I think anytime you can do a Tolkien adaptation where you reference this idea of song, of course that's primary for Tolkien. But also, if we think about the way the dwarves have been described in the song, we've heard that they sing to the rocks. We've heard, of course, that Disa has this funeral lament. So it almost seems like there's an idea that, much like the dwarves, there is an idea that the Harfoots they're not just part of the land. They not only can feel it, but they almost communicate with the land in some way that might go beyond written or, what other form of communication.
Yeah, and I definitely think that that's what might be happening here. And to also connect with the dwarves, at least for when Thorin and the quest for Erebor,
Mm,
they were kind of homeless, and they were really they were searching for a home basically, and that kind of almost mirrors what's happening with the Harfoots. What I'm guessing is they don't really necessarily want to be wandering, and
mm,
they were driven from whatever original homeland that they were in, and so they have this nomadic lifestyle out of necessity.
mm.
And maybe it's possible that they are kind of deep down yearning for their own homeland, which would eventually lead to the founding of the Shire.
Yeah. No, it's interesting as well. Like, there's this idea, I think, and maybe the show will explore it, but as you kind of said, definitely something that's explored in The Hobbit, of this idea that, the dwarves don't have a home because they've lost
Hmm.
Erebor. And we know from, or we are at least, I think we are at least led to believe through this song, this Wandering Day, that the Harfoots did once have a home and they are in search of it.
Hmm.
And there's other tracks in that soundtrack, and maybe we'll touch on those as well, like Nobody Goes Off Trail. I think there is a sense where, and this goes back to, I'm sorry, I'm going on several tangents at once, but it goes back to something Nori's actor said, was that Nori isn't trying to take risks because, as you said, like just for the fun of risk taking. She thinks it will be able to improve their way of life. She takes risks because she thinks that's how they're going to improve themselves. And I think maybe one of the core dynamics we're going to have at play is this idea of, is it better to be safe and in hiding, but basically
Hmm.
paralyzed and stagnant as a community and a society? Or is it better to take the Nori approach and take the risks in order to find a better future? And I wonder whether that, maybe we're going to see that between Nori and Poppy, between Nori and some of the elders. I'm not sure yet, but I feel like that must be a central idea at play.
Well, what I do find interesting that is a big similarity between the way that the Harfoot's lifestyle is now and the lifestyle of the hobbits in the Shire is that they are separated from the
Mm,
others. Now, while the Shire is so separated that they don't know what's going on in the outside world, the Harfoots do know what's going on, because you have to know what's going on in order to fully avoid it on the move.
Sure.
But there's that difference there, but there's still that kind of similarity between, let's say Nori wanting to possibly go outside of tradition and their laws and their standards, and let's say Bilbo and Frodo even wanting to go outside of the Shire's boundaries and their traditions and their standards as well. So it's I'm seeing this parallel here. While it's not completely mirrored, it's definitely a parallel that I'm noticing.
Yeah, and that's something I've wondered about as well. Like, we've talked about the parallels between Frodo and Sam and Nori and Poppy, and we talked about the parallels with Merry and Pippin. But maybe actually the greatest parallel here is Bilbo, right? Maybe the greatest parallel
Mm-hmm.
to Nori is it, and obviously, and that's not to say Poppy won't be important, but I do wonder to what extent, in the same way the Harfoots are proto hobbits, as they keep calling them, is Nori just proto Bilbo? Someone who has deep down that adventurous spark in them. And obviously it's not the same, because Bilbo has this place of safety that he's coming from,
Mm-hmm.
but they both end up at the same point, maybe.
Yeah, the circumstances are definitely different, but I am starting to see some sort of parallel there between, you've got characters who are defying what is commonplace, the social norms. So for the Harfoots, the social norms would be, don't interact with the outside, keep quiet, whatever we have been able to figure out from the teasers and everything. And then for the Shire, it's almost the same. They don't trust the outsiders. There's still this sense of not trusting the outside world that is linked between the Harfoots and the hobbits of the Shire. And so you still have these main characters who are going outside of those bounds, and that's where the parallel is. So it's very different circumstances, and so it's not the same, but it's definitely something that I'm noticing, and I'm really fascinated by it and see where it'll go.
Yeah. And I think this kind of naturally leads us on to, as I've been teasing the whole episode, as I've been saying, we're going to talk about it, but I think we have to talk about the stranger.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, I'm going to lead us in through that topic we were just discussing, because in the same way that Gandalf arrives on Bilbo's doorstep, and then later Gandalf, appears in Frodo's life, it is the presence of a wizard that brings the hobbits out of their comfort zone. And I mean, listen, I know everyone's got their theories on the stranger, but if we just start with that parallel, immediately that is screaming that the stranger is some form of wizard.
Now, I am 100, I mean, okay, well, I can't say 100% sure. I am 99.8% sure that
Strong.
the stranger is a wizard, and that really that has to do with the soundtrack, because Istari or Istar is wise one translated. A wizard, that's what it means. What wizard means is Istar. It means wise one, or knowledgeable one, or one with knowledge. And you have that track in the soundtrack, wise one, and that's a big thing right there. And I think that wise one track also shelves, at least for me, shelves the Sauron theory. I know I've been on the Stranger is Sauron train for a while, but I completely did a 180 recently, and I think the soundtrack suggests that he's not an insidious figure.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think we've been on the same journey, because when I first saw it, my immediate right from the very first teaser, when we heard about Meteor Man, and then we saw it and we saw there was a man inside the meteor, which it's funny now because we're so close to the premiere. I've got to the point where I've just accepted that there is a man landing in a meteor. But when you stop and think about that, it's an insane thing to say.
Well, to add on to that, actually, when we first heard about it from Fellowship of Fans, that
Yeah.
the whole Meteor Man thing, when I first took that information in, I really didn't know what to think. I thought it was kind of absurd, and I didn't want to you know, rant about it, but I just kind of didn't like the idea of what it sounded like. I was just like, I don't know, this sounds too weird. But then once the trailers started showing footage
Mm.
and you actually get to see the visuals, I completely changed my mind.
Mm.
I think that has to do with a lot of leaks. I think when you read leaks and rumors, you're missing some context.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you actually get to see it unfold visually, it can be completely different. It can really change what you think about it. Because now, as I've seen, we've seen footage, this whole Stranger plotline is becoming one of my most anticipated, storylines.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting because, as I was kind of saying, I was on the Sauron train at the start, but I was in it in a way where I thought, if this is Sauron, this is way too on the nose because it is a literal fallen angel falling to Earth on a meteor.
Hmm.
The Lucifer Morningstar parallels are a little too on the nose. They had him holding an apple, like the apple of knowledge, in his poster, and I was like, oh my god, if this is Sauron, this is like beating us over the head with the kind of Christian parallels. But at the same time, from the very first teaser, I, I think I was already moving away from that because, and it's really interesting that we've just seen that shot again in the latest trailer. They haven't used it at all since,
Hmm.
but in the very first trailer, if you go back and watch it, everyone, the end of the Super Bowl trailer, the very last shot they give us is of the stranger's hand holding what we now assume to be Nori's hand,
Hmm.
and I don't think there's any way you can look at that shot and not think that is immediately making you think of Gandalf and the Hobbit's relationship. Because I remember when I first saw that shot, I thought that's all I'm thinking of. That is all I can think of when I see that shot. And then in
Yeah.
this latest trailer we've got, again, the more and more footage, I'm not saying he's a comforting presence. I think he is an inherently dangerous presence to be around the Harfoots because there's something primal
Yeah.
about him. But it's not that he's trying to threaten them, if you get where I'm going.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I definitely second that. I think that, like you said in one of your earlier episodes, or was it on the space on Twitter? I'm not
Yeah.
sure, but there is. I do think that he could pose a threat to the Harfoots, but not on purpose.
Mm.
It's through him either because he has this purpose that, as the actor has said, nobody really knows about it. Like it doesn't seem that he really fully knows what it is yet himself, but he
Mm.
just has this deep sense of it. And so maybe in trying to figure out what his purpose is, what he's there to do, he accidentally, causes accidents or causes problems, especially
Mm.
since he is, he's big and he's magical, and as Poppy said in the clip that released today, they're aware that he's not a man
Mm.
or an elf, which that is something that I noticed immediately. They're already aware that this guy is not normal. This is not, obviously he's not normal. He came down from the sky in a meteor, but there's something else about him that is
Yeah.
completely different, other than his showy entrance. But
Yes.
they know that he's not a man.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think in that last trailer we got on Tuesday. We saw scenes of him putting forth these displays of power, whether it's
Mhm.
with the being cornered by these wolf type creatures, whether it's that, and God, I can't even talk about how much I love that shot of him screaming into the sky.
Yes, I love that shot too. Yeah, I really love
It's
that shot.
there's I don't even know what it is about it, but the fact that you can see the leaves on the trees bending in towards him,
Hmm.
almost like
Yeah, the cinematography of that shot, it's very dynamic, and it's great. And I think a lot of what intrigues me about The Stranger were from those quick shots that we've seen in the teasers and the trailers, that I just was really mesmerized by the cinematography. That's what's
mm,
really grabbing me. is the cinematography surrounding him, whether it's, those shots of Nori helping him out of whatever, fire situation that's happening,
Mm.
or, like from that recent trailer of him, yelling, and the trees are moving. It's just very fascinating to me.
Yeah, me too. Okay, I wanna I wanna try because I think there's a danger here that we could do what everyone has been doing, and we could sit on the
Hmm.
fence. So what I want us to do is I want us to rank these possibilities in terms of
Okay.
most likely to least. Okay, so first, do we agree he's definitely a wizard, not some form of other Maya?
Yes, I agree. I definitely think he's a wizard.
Okay, cool. Well, if he turns out not to be a wizard, nobody come back and listen to this episode. We never said that.
Please.
But okay, so saying he's a wizard, we've got really four options, right? We've got, is he one of the blue wizards? Is he Gandalf? Is he Saruman? Or is he Radagast? Which of those do you think is the least likely?
Least likely, I think Saruman is the least likely.
Hmm.
I just don't think I don't think he would be received well in that circumstance, especially since when you're listening to the soundtrack and it sounds like he has this, really good relationship with the Harfoots at the end, at least from what I'm noticing. Like you've mentioned it, the Wise One track almost reminds you of, the Grey Havens even.
Hmm.
Like there's some sort of emotional connection that he gains, and I just don't think Sauron would hold that spot. So I think
Yeah.
he's last.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Listen, I think if they do Sauron, it's not Sauron, sorry, Saruman. It's really interesting because then you almost get this, massive character arc from him, kind of being there with the hobbits all the way through to him, obviously where he reaches in the Third Age. But I think A, it wouldn't be satisfying, and B, it just,
Yeah, it wouldn't.
it's kind of one of those things where for like a casual audience member, I don't think it would work, and I think for while you
Hmm.
could justify it within the law, probably it would be. I think it would be unnecessary to do that kind
Yeah,
of stretching. Um,
yeah, I definitely agree.
yeah. So okay, we think he's least likely. I agree with you on that. Out of our remaining three options, who's the second most least likely?
I think that's when we get to Radagast,
Hmm.
honestly. Um, I mean, the one thing that I always think of is when I think it was in the books,
Mm.
when Gandalf was, explaining his conversations with Radagast, and Radagast calls the Shire uncouth,
Mm.
and I just that to me kind of puts him on the lower tiers of likelihood,
Yeah.
just remembering when he called the Shire uncouth, it makes me laugh. I don't think it would be him, um, especially since the other two options are just so much more likely.
Okay, I will give you my 30-second pitch for Radagast. I agree with you, by the way. He is also my second most likely, but I brought it up on the podcast this morning. I said, "Oh, maybe he could be Radagast," and really, I have two reasons. One is a bit meta, which is that I think Peter Jackson kind of did Radagast dirty in the Hobbit films. He just made him into like this kind of like hobo who like has bird poo in his hair, and
I mean, to be fair, it's not that much of a stretch.
it's not a stretch, but like I feel like it was the least charitable portrayal you could give to an Astari, possible. But so that's the
Probably,
meta
yeah.
reason. But I think the only other reason I would say that it could be him is that we know that obviously Radagast has this connection with animals and the woods and the
Hmm.
trees, and the clips we have seen of the stranger have been him bending the trees to his will, dealing with animals.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
yeah, it's again, it's a very thin
It's
theory.
loose.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
okay, we agree that he's the second most likely. Okay, so now, well, we're basically going to answer both at the same time.
Oh, great.
Okay, so out of our remaining two, we've got Blue Wizards, we've got Gandalf. There's no fence sitting now. You have to hitch your trailer to one or the other. We'll just skip who's least likely. Who is the most likely for it to be?
Ah, man, that's just really difficult because, like I've said, I think I mentioned it in the group chat, but I've been currently on like a big deep dive into his identity, and doing a
Mm.
lot of reading and a lot of research, and like every single time I think it might skew one way, I find something else, and it just, the scales are so close. It
Mm.
is going to be a very, very close call between Gandalf or a Blue Wizard to me. But I think I would possibly say I would go with Blue Wizard for number one, just because that's my preference.
Hmm.
But I mean, I'm telling you, it's really, really close. It's really close.
Okay, so seeing as you selected Blue Wizard, and I will spoil my own answer. I also agree with you. My top answer is Blue Wizard. For me, it's not that close, but that's why I want to ask you this next question. What is it that you see that if it weren't the Blue Wizards, what is pointing you towards your second best answer, Gandalf? What would be your kind of main arguments there?
Well, a lot of people would say, oh, it's lore breaking. However, they have a little bit of a loophole here with Gandalf, with Aloran,
Mm-hmm.
because Aloran did visit Middle Earth before the Third Age.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now, I'm pretty sure he was only around elves, pretty much. However, again, with the way that they're bending the lore
Mm-hmm.
they're really taking those loopholes with the lore in order to pad out the series.
Mm-hmm.
They could go with like an unnamed Gandalf, or just like an Aloran
Mm.
type of thing. Um, and then also you have there's a poeticism there
Mm.
between it being Gandalf with the Harfoots that doesn't exist with the Blue Wizard. So while I prefer the Blue Wizard as an option over Gandalf, there's a poetic nature to his journey beginning and ending with hobbits that doesn't exist with any other option.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people would say, oh, that's again, it's nostalgia bait, and that's whatever people would complain about it. But I really do think if it's well written, it being Gandalf wouldn't be a bad option if it's well written. And again, there's a poetry to it
Yeah.
that I think would be really fascinating.
Yeah, I completely agree, to be honest with you. I think my arguments against it are not actually about the law, and I agree with you that
Mhm.
okay, I'll say I do get why people think it would be just kind of nostalgia bait because everyone loves
Mhm.
Gandalf and people might think they're
Yeah.
capitalizing on that. Um but my main issue with it is not like is not really anything law based. It's it's actually just that I feel like I got 6 films worth of Gandalf and I got lots of Gandalf
Mhm.
in the books, and I'm kind of like, I feel like I've trod that road. But I will say that I 100% agree with you. Like, how poetic would it be if in
Mhm.
Gandalf's earlier travels to Middle Earth, he goes there, he meets these proto hobbits, he sees the courage. Not only does he see the courage, but he is saved and looked after, and he sees the generosity of their hearts in this, in his almost, I was going to say meteoric, but that's too much of a pun. In his meteoric arrival to Middle Earth, and I agree. There's a beautiful poetry to that, and you then put layers on top of that, and you say, okay, well, does he see um, does he see Poppy? Sorry, not Poppy. Nori. Does he see Nori in Bilbo? Does he see Poppy in
Yeah.
Sam? All these years later, there's great poetry in there. And as for whether it would break the law in terms of Gandalf never having talked about this, well, one of the things that the Tolkien professor talked about in, believe it or not, a TikTok he did from Mythmoot, he talked about this idea that Maiar may not actually retain their memories fully when they come to Middle Earth. There is a part of them becoming,
Mhm.
corporal beings and taking on physical forms that actually separates them from their true angelic nature. And so there's definitely a way you could retcon it. I think I agree with you. I think there'd be a lot of poetry to it, but I do think it's less likely. If it, so I guess we've talked about Gandalf, but if it is a blue wizard, what would you like to see? Because I think we can assume that if it's a blue wizard, after after he's done everything with the Harfoots this season, he's going to head east because that's what the Blue Wizards do canonically.
Hmm.
If it is a Blue Wizard, what would you like to see come from this season one story? Like, what are the thematic or emotional beats you want to see from that?
Well, I definitely think it would have to do with the hobbits and how they they do influence the world, even if it's not in the form of going to war or directly being involved in the politics. So if you
Mm,
have, these Maiar, you know, constantly coming into contact with them, you know, it I definitely think there's that there's something meaningful there that, the hobbits have always that the hobbits have always been there, and they do have an impact on the world even if they're not in the histories.
I think that's it for me as well. Like, I think it's about this idea of small hands doing great work, right? And like, I think it almost doesn't matter whether it's Gandalf or Blue Wizard. It honestly, while I'm 100% sure it, or as you said, we can't be 100% sure. As you said, 99.8% sure it's a wizard. Um, Even if it wasn't and it was another Maya, it almost doesn't matter to me because it's about that relationship between the greatest of beings, an angelic being, and the smallest of beings, and that fact that, the small hands do great work. And there's something really beautiful for me about that. But I also want to kind of return to the idea that I think we both agree, or maybe we don't, and you can tell me. But I'm fairly convinced that the stranger is going to leave the Harfoots at the end of this season. And what are your thoughts
Yeah.
on that?
Yeah, I definitely think that the Wise One track does reveal a lot of the emotional climax of their storyline, if not the emotional climax of the entire season, even,
Hmm.
um, because that track is very emotional, and as you said, it does kind of give that imagery of the Grey Havens,
Hmm.
and though at the very end when it goes into Nori's theme, it's very hopeful, and so that's why I'm thinking that this won't be the last, hopefully, that we see of the Harfoots, that it'll carry on throughout the series,
Mm.
because that last bit of Nori's theme there is very, it's very deeply, it's emotional, and it's very deep and hopeful, and that's what I kind of get from the entire track. It's sad, but it's hopeful. There's a bittersweetness to it.
Yeah, I think you've 100% nailed it with the bittersweet element of it. I think, and I know I've talked about this before about this idea of it paralleling the Grey Havens. I do think it is bittersweet rather than despairing, and it's not quite purely hopeful. And I have no doubt. I would be very surprised if the showrunners dropped the Harfoots after season one. I do think,
Oh yeah.
but I do think this is probably going to be the end of their interactions with the stranger,
Yeah.
which is sad. But hopefully, we'll get enough content in season.
Well, yeah, that's where it takes me into the Blue Wizard territory, because the Blue Wizards are known for being in the South and the East.
Mm.
And so when it comes to Gandalf, Gandalf was in the South, but from my remembrance, he never went east. He stayed
Yes,
away from the
he
East.
specifically
That was
says
the
it.
one. Yeah, that was the one area that he did not go. So depending on um, how far they do end up traveling in the show, in the season, and if the stranger is departing, and
Mm.
if he's a blue wizard, he would definitely be going east.
Yeah. Well, that's you're quite right. Like, Gandalf has this line. Well, he doesn't actually have the line. It's really interesting. I think I used it on a previous podcast as my opening reading. It's Faramir talking to Frodo about Gandalf because he knew him as the Grey
Hmm.
Pilgrim, and he's recounting Gandalf saying to him that in the west of my youth I was called Alorin, the elves I'm Mithrandir, the dwarves I'm Tharkun, in the north they called me Gandalf, and he says, to the east I go not. And so you're quite right,
Hmm.
I think, in that is also an argument against it being Gandalf, because if it were Gandalf, why is he that far east?
Well, the thing is that if you could say that they're right now in the show that they're more south than they are east, and he did go south, and that's
Yes.
again where the scale is just constantly tipping it for me. At first I was like, oh yeah, okay, well this obviously points to the Blue Wizards then because they're associated with the east and the south. But then as I'm doing more reading, well, Gandalf did go south. However, I don't think he went past near Harad,
Yeah.
from what I take of it. Um, and I don't think, apparently he didn't go much, he couldn't have gone much farther past Gondor.
Yeah.
So, it's depending on how they take the lore.
Yeah.
Um, Again, it's a really close call.
Yeah.
But again, with the Blue Wizards being associated with the East and the South, that's definitely a big one up for the Blue Wizard
Yeah,
theory.
definitely. I mean, I made this joke on Twitter a while ago, but I do really like the idea that if it's one of the Blue Wizards and that the stranger doesn't have his memory, if he gets the end of the season, he's like, "Oh my god, where's my best friend?" Because they travel as a pair
Yeah,
of them.
yeah.
Well, that is almost that's the thing for me that like even though the Blue Wizards are my favorite, that is the one bit that really confuses me. That if he is a Blue Wizard, why isn't he with if he's Alatar, where's Palando?
hmm Well, while that could be a sign that maybe he isn't a Blue Wizard, at the same time, if he is a Blue Wizard, that could clue us into a possible continuation of his storyline. So
Mm,
if he's a Blue Wizard and the season ends with him leaving the Harfoots
yeah.
and going off on his own journey, and Nori going off, on her own journey, that could the potential storyline continuation from there could be, well, I did come here as originally I was supposed to come here as a pair. Where is that other? And he could
Mm.
possibly, maybe he has a journey to find the other Blue Wizard.
Yeah, yeah, and it would be super
Yeah.
interesting as well. Like the Harfoots are wandering to find a home. He's wandering to find his,
Mhm.
his companion. They're traveling west. He's traveling east. In many ways, he and
Mhm.
Nori would therefore be almost like direct parallels of one another. So I no,
Mhm.
I really like that. Well, I feel like we've kind of we've dug deep on the stranger. Unless there's anything else you want to cover on him, otherwise I've got a few more questions on the Harfoots I wanted to cover.
I think that's it on the stranger. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got a few rapid fire questions on the Harfoots, and
Okay. Yeah.
you can take them however you want, and then we can cover anything else. So rapid fire questions on the Harfoots. Does one of the Harfoots die before the end of the season?
Before the end of the season, no. Well, oh shoot. uh, Maybe. I mean, if you're talking about like the main ones
hmm
being like Nori or Poppy, then I'd say no.
hmm
Maybe not even Largo or Marigold, but maybe Sadok eventually. Maybe Sadok. I'm not sure. If I had to pick, I'd probably say no.
Okay. Okay, so you're saying not a named Harfoot, but you're saying there's a small chance of like a secondary Harfoot.
Uh, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think eventually down the line there will probably be a major character death, but
Mm.
unfortunately. But I think for the first season, I don't think we're going to see something major.
Okay. Okay. Is Poppy an orphan?
Probably.
Probably. So we think that,
I, I I just I just think we would have seen or heard something about her parents. Like, where is her parents? Like, she's following Nori around. Like, girl, where is your parents? So, and then also, I believe Sarah, the actress who plays Marigold, I
yes.
believe. I think she said something about on one of the panels, something about her being kind of like a surrogate, and so
Mm.
we can't really tell if that was literal, like she literally took her in as a child and raised her,
Mm.
or if it's more figurative, as oh, you still don't really have parental figures, but you're really close to my child, and so I'm kind of like that. But I do think it's likely.
It's really interesting as well because there was an interview with Nori's actor where they said that she's
Mhm.
had to care for her siblings from a young age. She's had to grow up
Mhm.
too quickly. And I was like, that's strange because her parents are around, I think. So there's a lot of interesting family dynamics I don't think we quite understand yet, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. Next quickfire question. Do the Harfoots encounter orcs during season 1?
I'm gonna say maybe no for season 1, but I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's impossible. I think it's more likely they come across some sort of like creatures, like those wolf things that we saw in the most recent trailer. But I definitely don't think I think it's likely that they will eventually come across orcs, but maybe not the first season.
Yeah, I think it's tied to your other answer about do we think Harfoots are going to die, and I think when Harfoots end up encountering orcs, some of them are going to die. So you're right, maybe not season 1. Okay, similar sort of question. So we've seen in one of the trailers, or we're led to believe, it's a little bit tricky the way it's edited, but we're led to believe the Harfoots are in the same area as the Ents. Do we think we see the Harfoots and Ents interacting together?
I think eventually, hopefully. This season, it's hard for me to say yes or no to anything because my personal stance from going into this show has been, I don't want to set certain particular expectations. I want to appreciate this piece of art that's been created as it is for what it is.
Yeah.
But I don't really think we might see them right now interacting with each other, but I think we might see them within the same proximity.
Okay, and last Harfoot question, and we're only going to find this answer out in about 5 years, so say whatever you want because it's not going to matter. It would break the law, but do you think we end season 5 with the Harfoots discovering the Shire?
I was actually going to bring that up because they could potentially do it in a way that doesn't break the lore. From what I remember, I think the Shire was founded. I think it was Third Age 1600. I don't quote me on that. Right. And it was actually founded by some of the Fallowhides because the Fallowhides kind of merged in with the Harfoots, if I'm remembering correctly. And it depends on where the show is going to end. A lot of people are expecting to see The Last Alliance, but I'm not sure if we'll see The Last Alliance or if we'll just end it up to The Last Alliance. So it really depends on where they want to end it. But I do think it would be interesting if because the ages are separated by kind of cataclysmic events and The Last Alliance kind of begins the Third Age, I guess.
Well, you get the fall of Sauron being the kind of end of the Second Age, yeah. Yeah,
so each age is kind of separated by these big cataclysmic kind of events almost. And so I think if we do end up seeing The Last Alliance in full, they might do some sort of time compression because we know that there's a lot of time compression in the show already. They might do some sort of time compression that we do end up seeing, maybe not the Shire built, but them kind of scouring the area of the Shire, maybe.
Poor choice of words with scouring, I think.
Oh no, not that kind of scouring. definitely not that.
Yeah. No, I know what you're saying though.
That's not the right. Yeah.
I know what you're saying, but I think
I think it would be interesting if we saw, the movies begin with The Last Alliance and Hobbits. How great would it be if the show ends with The Last Alliance and Hobbits? I think there's a big potential there.
Yeah.
If they do time compression and they do keep the Shire being created in the Third Age, I don't necessarily think it would be that big of a lore break.
No, I think you're right. I don't think it would be a massive. I don't think it would be a massive lore break. I think. Okay, here's a really random theory, but I 100% believe they're going to do The Last Alliance. I think where they'll end the kind of concurrent storytelling is with Isildur dying, losing the ring at the Gladden Fields, because I think that kind of wraps up the core of the story. But here's a wild theory. What if we have that shot, Isildur dying, rings sinking to the bottom of the river, and then they kind of fade to black, and then it says, something like, a long time in the future. This is horrible. Please don't do this, showrunners. This is my idea. But it's like a long time in the future, and we fade out of black, and we see Harfoots or hobbits, but it's not the hobbits we know. But maybe there's some kind of, whether it's like clothing or like, you know, heirloom that's been passed down that we'll recognize from Poppy that one of them's carrying, and it's the hobbits first discovering the Shire. And, you know, one of them saying, oh, yes, you know, this feels like our wandering is done. This feels like it could be home. I would quite like that, even though it's very cheesy.
That would. Okay, well, you know what? Cheesy, you know, who cares? I mean, I really like that idea, actually. I actually really like that.
It requires them to like go full kind of Hallmark Channel, you know, cheesy ending. But otherwise, my issue with the show is that, and I know we're meant to be talking about the Harfoots this episode, but we'll get back on topic in a second for the end. But I do actually think there's something that there's a danger that this show could end after 5 seasons being really depressing, because the end of the Second Age has almost like,
Yeah.
yeah, Sauron's defeated, but most of our main characters are dead. And Numenor's gone,
Yeah.
and the dwarvish kingdoms have really gone insular, and the elves have been diminished to a great degree. So that's one of the reasons I think why the Harfoots might be the through line, because the Harfoots would allow us to end on a sort of hopeful ending.
And I think, yeah, it would also add that bittersweetness that runs through all of Tolkien's works. Is if you ended it, you know, you see the last alliance and how, you know, depressing that is. Even if it's a victory, it's extremely depressing. But then you have that hopeful seed planted, possibly with seeing the Shire's beginnings.
Yeah. Well, listen. Let's hope we're right, because I think that's a lovely ending. Is there anything we haven't covered about the Harfoots or the characters that you wanted to cover?
Yes, actually, I just remembered. Even though I have my notes sitting right here, I can't believe I didn't bring this up earlier. But one of the biggest things that the soundtrack reveals is that a storyline connection between these cultist priestess people and the stranger. Because if I'm guessing the Mystics refers to those priestess people, it seems likely. But in that track, the latter half of that track very heavily features the Stranger's theme, very heavily, and after that it fades into Nori's theme. So that to me that suggests that there's going to be some sort of altercation between these mystic priestess cultist people and the Stranger and Nori.
Yeah.
So that's a huge possible plot detail there that we wouldn't have been able to guess until, you know, if you're paying attention to the soundtrack.
Yeah, that's super interesting as well, because I think if you kind of break it down, we know that Galadriel, the Númenóreans, they're dealing with the orcs and Adar. So it would be interesting because I've kind of thought that, and I talked about on today's episode, again, this is kind of big spoiler speculation, so if you don't want to listen to this, feel free to tune out. But, you know, I've got the speculation that the cultists may be involved in the big explosion. Maybe it's got something to do with Mount Doom. But if the cultists are instead occupied with Adar, I mean, who knows? Maybe all these storylines collide. Maybe Adar is also, the Stranger is also involved with the Galadriel and the Númenóreans. At this point, it's too hard to tell like what that interaction could be. But I love the idea of Galadriel being in opposition to Adar and the Stranger being in opposition to the cultists, because then you have that kind of good evil back and forth on multiple storylines, which is always better than just having one kind of bad guy to go up against.
Yeah, and the dots are starting to connect a bit. Once I was listening to the Mystics track and I noticed that it starts to, you can start to see how things are beginning to come full circle a little bit. And because from what we know, the priestess cult people, I think they're coming from Rune. They're coming from the east,
yes,
right? And so it seems like our biggest location is going to be in that, you know, pre-Mordor area, it seems to me.
Yeah.
Which is really fascinating.
Yes. Yeah, no, I agree. I think you're absolutely right. And I think there's also, in a weird way, you could almost connect it and say, well, okay, I mean, we know that the blue wizards go go east because they're trying to, combat the darkness, but it would make a much more personal connection if the stranger had come into direct conflict with these cultists from Rune and then said, okay, well,
Exactly.
something's going on in Rune, I need to go and
yeah.
investigate that.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Yeah. Okay, well, that is a very cool note to end on. I didn't expect we were going to get to tie in the cultists, so I'm glad we got to cover that. So just to finish, because we've talked about the Harfoots, but obviously I love asking guests on my show and just getting their general thoughts. Apart from the Harfoots, and it could be a plot, a character, a general thing about the show, what is it that you're most excited for in the show apart from the Harfoots?
Yeah, apart from the Harfoots, I'd say probably the Numenorians, because I'm really a big fan of like nautical things, and the fact that we haven't really seen like ships and the ocean, things like that in a big scale before on screen is really, really exciting. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to the Numenorian stuff. The Numenorian plotline is just amazing, and I'm really excited to see how that unfolds, because this has the potential to be some of the best things that we could possibly see on screen.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more, and I do like that you've chosen the kind of two opposite ends of the spectrum. You've got the Harfoots and the Numenorians, about
completely different
tones. Yeah. Well, that's great. Listen, Kylie, thank you so much for coming on the episode. Thank you, for getting me to talk about Harfoots. I have made up for my crimes of ignoring the Harfoots for too long. Thank you for talking me through all your amazing analysis on the soundtrack and theory crafting me with The Stranger. People should follow you because you send out great tweets, but where can people find you on Twitter if they want to interact with you, follow you, all that good stuff?
Well, now my handle is at Sundered Seas, so that's my handle now.
Yep.
It was something else before, but now I've changed it. I've changed my branding, so you can find me on Twitter mostly at Sundered Seas.
Fantastic. Well, I'll put the link to your Twitter handle in the description below. And is there any message you want to leave with our listeners as we get into, I guess, by the time this episode goes out, will be just over 7.5, 8 days till the show comes out?
No, I think I've said all of that's on my mind, but I will like to thank you for having me on here. It's really exciting, and I'm really happy to be on here.
Well, listen, Kylie, thank you so much for coming on again. We'll definitely have you back on at some point in the future, and I can't wait to talk more about the Rings of Power and Harfoots once we've actually seen some of their storylines. So thank you again.
Yeah, anytime. Thank you.
Not a problem. We'll have you back very soon. Well, listeners, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Kylie is a wonderful person to follow on Twitter and always spreads so much positivity in the fandom. Thank you once again to Kylie for coming on the show, and hopefully she'll join us again at some point in the future. As I said at the top of the show, we've got a packed week ahead of us, and once the show airs, you can expect not only an instant reaction episode on Friday, but I'll also be hosting a weekly episode breakdown with a special guest. In that episode, we'll go in depth to all our thoughts and ideas about the scenes we've seen, but we'll have more to come on that later this week. As always, I'd greatly appreciate if you could leave a rating or review on whichever podcast platform you use, and if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back tomorrow with more discussion as we head into the final week before the show on the Daily Rings of Power podcast. Namarie.